Hello, my name is Mary Rose, and welcome to The $1 billion Painting. Chances are the first work of art that will sell for $1 billion already exists. Today we're going to talk about one potential candidate by the British artist Damien Hirst. And along the way we'll investigate art world insiderism and ask if raw materials and cult of personality are enough to lead to the first $1 billion artwork. As always, you can find accompanying pictures for today's show and further reading on our website, bedazzledpodcast.com. Dead artists don't make new art. When people ask me why I think the $1 billion painting, and in today's episode's case maybe sculpture, already exists, I keep returning to this point. Dead artists don't make new art. Dead artists don't make new art. The works of art of artists who have already passed away are just more valuable. Contemporary artists that are still alive and working are kind of a risky investment. There's no telling what they might produce in the future, and so when an investor is looking for something and saying, well, what is the supply of this? It's kind of an open-ended question. There's no telling what the supply will end up being, and there's no telling how important they will seem to be in their own lifetimes. So the theory goes anyway. And so the supply is not fixed, and the collectors aren't motivated to spend quite as much money on them as they are on artists that have already passed away. But there are a few contemporary artists who seem determined to sell. These creators gone capitalists play a game, and they play it very well. They're making a killing. Our artist today, Damien Hirst, is one of the most famous names in the contemporary art world. And today, I'll dedicate an episode to discussing whether or not one contemporary artist could surprise us all and create a $1 billion work of art. The work we're going to talk about today is called For the Love of God. For the Love of God is a skull, but it's not just any skull. It's a platinum cast of a human skull from the 18th century, set with the original human teeth cleaned up by a dentist, and 8,601 flawless diamonds. One of the diamonds is an enormous pink diamond from Angola, set at the center of the forehead. Everyone has a different reaction to For the Love of God, and has since it went on exhibition at the White Cube Gallery in London in 2007 for the first time. The art historian Rudy Fuchs called it, quote, a resplendent apparition, glittering effigy of death, cryptic reliquary, science fiction warrior mask. And some people do seem to think there's something historical and fascinating about it. It recalls turquoise-encrusted skulls from the Aztec Empire, or maybe memento mori images in European art. Other people think it's ethically ambiguous. After all, what right does Damien Hirst have to own a piece of another human? What does it say about people that come to see this macabre spectacle? Or other people are ethically concerned by the support of the notoriously bloody diamond trade. Still others think it's a just gaudy trinket, another Fabergé egg for the ultra-wealthy. I, for one, think that the Fabergé egg comparison is pretty perfectly suited. For the Love of God, which, by the way, is a name that was inspired by the artist's mother, who, when she saw how his early career was going, said, "For the love of God, what are you going to make next?" And so this sculpture, it cost an estimated $23.5 million to make. Hirst commissioned Jack DeRose to design and sculpt it, with the assistance of Bentley and Skinner, who are an upscale jewelry seller who also create works of art for the British royal family. Of course, many people will be frustrated that this sculpture that is called a Damien Hirst was not made by Damien Hirst himself. But that's par for the course in Damien Hirst's artwork. Hirst's most famous paintings, I would call them, are all created by assistants. They're his series of either dot or spin paintings. And according to him, if buyers received a work of art that was exclusively by him, that is to say only his hands touched it, they'd be receiving what he calls a quote-unquote inferior product. This isn't unique to Hirst. This kind of factory production mindset was popularized a generation earlier by Andy Warhol, although, of course, he wasn't the first either. It's got a very rich tradition in 20th century art. In fact, according to Hari Gunsru, writing for The Guardian, this was part of what made Hirst a breath of fresh air. It was kind of this heritage of Cockney characters like David Bailey and Keith Moon, who were these working class guys sticking it to the man. There was something kind of funny about this working class young kid from Bristol who said, I can't be bothered to make my own art, and kind of flipped his two fingers off to these ultra wealthy collectors and took advantage of them, swindled them, almost. But of course now, Damien Hirst is no longer a plucky, Cockney, working class man. He is extremely wealthy, and we'll get to that in a minute. According to the New York Magazine art critic Jerry Seltz, this way the artworks that Hirst makes are more like designer handbags. People pay for the name brand, even if you know that Louis Vuitton is no longer stitching all of the handbags. Now, I couldn't slap my hand on something and just demand that people start paying millions of dollars for it with my name on it. So what makes someone able to demand these astronomical prices? What makes a Hirst comparable to a Gucci or a Prada? Hirst was born in 1965 in Bristol, England, and he had this kind of troubled pseudo-goth childhood. He became somewhat fascinated by death in his youth, and he's long said that all of his favorite artworks, in some way or another, talk about death. His mother cut up his bondage trousers and destroyed his Sex Pistols records, but she did encourage him to draw. After being rejected from a number of schools during his childhood for kind of shoddy academic record and behavioral problems, Hirst studied at Goldsmiths, University of London. In the late 1980s, Hirst exhibited a few times, but he didn't really gain gallery representation for a while. Many of the fellows he exhibited with had also graduated from Goldsmiths, and they came to be known as the Young British Artists, or YBAs. The other of the most famous of the YBAs today is Tracey Emin, who is most well known today for her My Bed installation. My Bed is a work in which Emin moved her own bed into the Tate Gallery, complete with menstrual-stained underwear, cigarette packets, and condoms. It's kind of a viscerally gross experience to look at it, and it's also one of the hallmarks of a kind of ready-made feminist art, and of the YBAs in general, who defined British art in the 1990s. Hirst tried a few different styles of art, including simple painted cardboard boxes, but to no avail. Around this time, Hirst was quoted as saying, quote, I can't wait to get into a position to make really bad art and get away with it. At the moment, if I did certain things, people would look at it, consider it, and then say, F off. But after a while, you can get away with things. And how prophetic that seems in hindsight. Then, Charles Saatchi, who came along. Saatchi is an Iraqi-British advertising executive, now one of the titans of the art world and the owner of Saatchi Gallery. In 1990, he brought one of Hirst's artworks and granted his approval to the young artist. For the interested, the artwork was entitled 1,000 Years, and it was a rotting cow's head in a tank with flies and maggots. Get away with things, indeed, Mr. Hirst. Saatchi really brought Hirst and the rest of the YBAs into the fold and encouraged their early exhibitions. In 1991, Saatchi commissioned Hirst's most famous work, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. It's a stuffed tiger shark floating in formaldehyde, and the subject of Don Thompson's superb book, The $12 Million Stuffed Shark, The Curious Economics of Contemporary Art, which I highly recommend if this podcast or anything in it has really struck your interest as to the economics of the art world. It's really a fascinating and very quick read with a lot of information in it. The only reason that I'm going to exclude this extremely famous work is that it is a disaster to try to take care of. The shark has actually been replaced once, which has led all sorts of kind of ethical mumblings about whether or not it's even the same work of art if you swapped the shark, because it was falling apart because of how poorly it had been preserved. And so I think that most collectors would be more inclined to not want to collect it on the off chance that while they owned it, it fell apart again. It's another one of those artworks that, even if people can't remember the artist's name, most people find it in their hearts to hate the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living. Hirst is just this maypole of controversy, and everyone has something to say about him. He is really one of those artists that justifies the name, or, the saying that he's someone you love to hate. Some animal rights activists criticize the estimated 913,450 animals who have died for Damien Hirst's artwork. Some people point to the continued accusations of plagiarism that have followed his works, including a 2004 accusation that his artwork Him was based on a copyrighted design for an anatomical toy. Some people can't stand him personally. In 2002, about a year after the attacks of 9/11 in America, he called it an ultimate act of performance art and suggested that we should just be shocked and almost a little celebratory and proud that people have managed to pull this off. Obviously, he was then forced to apologize before he was, I think, roundly dismissed by any American or American sympathizing people anywhere in the world. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that people hate about him personally. Some people can't stand the fact that he employs this team of assistants to create his works of art and pays them very poorly. Some people can't stand this art world insiderism. I'm not an animal ethicist, nor am I a lawyer, but I am an art historian, and so let's look at the insiderism bit first. We're going to have to look at what makes some artists like Hirst titans, while other artists are virtually unknown, and why some galleries succeed and others fail. Magnus Rake wrote the book on managing art galleries, quite literally, when he published the appropriately named Management of Art Galleries in 2015. In this book, he writes that there are two art markets. At the very top are the ones who are selling works of art for millions of dollars, these elite galleries and very famous artists. Then there are the majority, your smaller galleries and artists who are barely scraping by. Most art galleries actually close within 5 years of being founded, and you'll be surprised as to those that don't close, and yet the only reason they don't is because they're being funded from the outside as kind of passion projects. They're being funded by people who don't need them to make a profit, and most of them certainly don't. It's almost like a microcosm of our own inequitable economy. And you'll probably have seen this yourself in one way or another. Almost all of us know a friend, colleague, family member, neighbor who exhibits in small local galleries from time to time. And sometimes you'll sit there looking at their artwork and think, well, this is better than anything that's selling for millions and millions of dollars today. We might even know artists who go beyond the hobbyist and are quite famous locally. They are making their living as artists, but then they don't get internationally famous. Why? Rake also launched an app called Magnus, which tracks the careers of 500,000 artists and exhibitions at 20,000 auctions and galleries. Then he teamed up with this kind of superstar science research team from Harvard and Northeastern to make sense of this huge amount of data. With this analysis, we can see things even more clearly. Basically, there are almost hubs, is what he calls them, in the art world that act like thresholds. If you can get in the door in these places, you've made it, and you'll have an infinitely higher chance of succeeding as an artist. There are the kind of top 3 tiers I'll describe here. The 2 most prominent of these hubs are the Museum of Modern Art and the Guggenheim Museum, both in New York. Then the next tier down is the Gagosian and Pace galleries. And then below that, 3 more museums: the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Whitney Museum. So, throughout this, the rest of the art works and galleries are stuck in their own local hubs. So, artists that might get to exhibit at one gallery locally will be stuck within a gallery circuit that's very localized, usually by geography. And there are some museums that can help you break out of that, but there aren't that many. And it's getting increasingly hard to become one of these artists that's able to break in, because most museums will look around and say, well, you haven't exhibited anywhere else in our hub. Why should we trust your artwork to be valuable enough that we should exhibit you? So artists that are working through their career hoping that one day they might get discovered by these huge galleries usually aren't. This is one thing I want us to pay attention to moving forward if we're going to consider an artist who might be exhibiting in a kind of contemporary scene, or who will be exhibited from anywhere in the 20th century, really, and are they accessing these hubs? Are they being exhibited at places that, like the Gagosian, or the Pace, or the Guggenheim, or the MoMA? Are they being exhibited in these places that really launch careers? So, instead, artists that are not able to reach this kind of threshold hub, they're stuck in the local, smaller hubs, and they aren't guaranteed the amount of money and success that other artists are able to receive. While Hirst had this sort of fairy tale story where Charles Saatchi fell in love with his rotted cowhead, he's a classic example of this kind of art world insiderism. He's been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art several times, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art at least once that I'm aware of. He was so closely tied to the Gagosian Gallery, who had represented him for 17 years, that when he departed in 2012, the New York Times reported that it set back the entire gallery. It's part of a trend of contemporary artists, according to Tobias Meyer, the director of Sotheby's Contemporary Art Division, to use the galleries first for their first few shows, let them be represented, and then become these self-propelled machines who are able to launch themselves out, and very few artists are able to actually do that. Damien Hirst is one. He's able to sell based on the pure force of his personality and his history and the amount that he's well known alone, rather than having to rely on a dealer to kind of broker his sales. Meyer compares these artists like Hirst, Jeff Koons, there's a few others, to actors in the 1950s who had been formerly tied to their studios, and then suddenly they had their own cults of personality that could support independent careers. And that's why you get the kind of rise of the Hollywood starlet, who isn't just what I guess you would call in Hollywood history like an MGM starlet, who are somewhat anonymous and tied to their companies. Hirst's artwork can be found in the collections of the royal family of Qatar, hedge fund manager Stephen A. Cohen, pop star Courtney Love. Then it just goes on and on. He just seems to have this huge bank of collectors who love him. And so even if many career artists don't want to admit it because they absolutely detest the guy and his attitude for the reasons I've stated before, he has what many artists want. But how is this all working out for Damien Hirst? Some have claimed that Hirst is the richest living artist to date. His decision to bypass his galleries and conduct a solo auction of his artwork through Sotheby's in London raised $198 million in 2008 alone. He attributes his own success to his business manager, Frank Dunphy, who reportedly takes 10% of the artist's sales. And certainly the two men aren't hurting for money. Damien Hirst is well known for his collection of Picassos and Jeff Koons. Certainly, most artists couldn't fork up the astronomical amount of money it would take to put a platinum-plated, 1,106.18 carat diamond-encrusted skull together. According to Harry Levi, who is the vice chairman of the London Diamond Boursin Club, the skull, in terms of raw materials, is worth something like 7 million to 10 million pounds. And of course, the actual value of diamonds has always been pretty questionable, and so we may never be certain what would happen if you were to, say, break up the skull and kind of divorce it from the Damien Hirst context. And yet something very odd is happening. Although Hirst is still mega wealthy, it would seem that his appeal is slowly fading away. According to New York Times author Carol Vogel, he made his most commercially viable sales and production during a period roughly from 2005 to 2008, but that these works are now selling for 30% less with every resale. Roughly a third of the 1,700 Hirst artworks that have gone up to auction since 2009 have not yet reached their minimum bids. For the Love of God had an original asking price of £50 million in 2007, which would have been the most expensive work of art sold by a living artist. George Michael, former member of the band Wham, was said to be interested in the skull, but nothing came of this. Then Hirst took the skull on a few exhibitions, starting in the autumn of 2008 at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, moving on to the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, at the Tate Modern, in an exhibition in Qatar. And yet, this £50 million just did not materialize. Christina Ruiz, editor of the art newspaper, claimed that Hirst dropped the price to $38 million in an attempt to desperately find some sort of buyer. And then he did. Hirst sold the skull for an undisclosed amount to a consortium. It was reported to be at that $50 million mark. And who was in that consortium? Well, for a start, Damien Hirst. So to recap, Hirst sells the skull to a group that includes himself. And we discussed this phenomenon of consortiums buying and selling art before in our episode about Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi. But in the future, we really do have to keep an eye on these consortiums. They're a way to group invest in something, perhaps to mitigate the potential losses of a bad investment. Maybe this turned out to be a good idea when everyone started losing money on their Damien Hirst. This is the thing about contemporary artists. They keep producing, and their market prices are much more likely to fluctuate depending on what they end up producing, and if they happen to upset anybody. For an artist like Damien Hirst, who thrives in the kind of controversy that would, say, tank a Fortune 500 CEO, it's a risky investment to say the least. For the Love of God has several strikes against it in the pursuit of the billion-dollar artwork. The fact that it's a sculpture is one, and that's partially why I named this podcast The Billion-Dollar Painting. Paintings are just more valuable. In my personal opinion, I would expect a painting to sell for $1 billion before a sculpture, and maybe we'll explore that more someday. But I wanted to make a special exception to talk about Hirst. And the second is that Damien Hirst is still alive, and while he's alive, the value of his artworks just continue to fluctuate. The third is that more and more people are a little bit concerned about the ethics of someone like Damien Hirst, who's not making his artworks by hand. We discussed before how important it was in our talk about Salvator Mundi in discerning whether or not an artwork is authentically by the artist. However much Damien Hirst likes to say that he would deliver an inferior product if it was just his hand, there's no denying that collectors like this kind of genius of the artist idea that makes that artist's brushstroke valuable. People want the authentic detail. We'll talk about this in a future episode about Andy Warhol, I think, but I think it's a brilliant comparison in that Andy Warhol kind of thought he would make himself a sort of factory for expensive artworks, but in doing so, he might have long-term shot himself in the foot in terms of his sales prices. There's no denying the two central themes of Hirst's artwork are death and money. And For the Love of God really does epitomize both. It's Van Gogh's Sunflower, or Monet's Lily Pads, or Picasso's Cubism. It's what makes that artist. And depending on how cynical the market is feeling, they either love it, or they think it's kind of skeevy and they hate it. And of course, I could be totally wrong. After all, Hirst won't live forever, and maybe in 40 years, his stuffed shark will be our generation's Salvator Mundi. Of course, maybe it will be For the Love of God. Damien Hirst loves to surprise us, and if he has friends in the right places, For the Love of God could become the first billion-dollar artwork. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and leave a 5-star review. It helps more people find their way to the show. You can also find more information about For the Love of God and other artworks by visiting the website bedazzled.com. You can tweet at us at @billionpainting, follow our Instagram at thebilliondollarpainting, or you can email us at thebilliondollarpainting@gmail.com. See you next week.